The first tenet of critical race theory is that the United States as constructed is irreversibly racist. So if the nation state as constructed is irreversibly racist, then it must be done with. It must be overthrown, right? You can't be a critical race theorist and be pro-US, okay? It is an anti-state theory that says the United States needs to be deconstructed, period.
Let's talk about ethnic studies. This is something that was mandated over the last couple of years in the recent term here in the state of Minnesota. Now, on its face, the idea of ethnic studies might sound appealing because we have a lot of ethnicities within our culture, and it is important that we understand one another and that we understand history, we understand where we've been and where we're going, that we have proper perspective. That's important, without a doubt. And that's certainly how this proposal was sold. We heard legislators on the House floor and in committee, when they were advancing this proposal, talk about the importance of people being seen, the importance of history being taught, the notion that our students ought to be exposed to perspectives that they may not encounter in their day-to-day lives. All of that is, of course, entirely legitimate. But what is the actual content of the ethnic studies mandate, and what is the actual agenda behind what has been passed in the state of Minnesota? Well, we got some insight into that recently when a video was unearthed that showed some comments made by one of the folks who's been appointed by Governor Tim Walz here in the state of Minnesota to be part of the task force that comes up with how this ethnic studies is implemented. This comes from the Center of the American Experiment, but there's been reporting elsewhere on it as well. The headline is, Walz Education Appointee Calls for Overthrow of U.S. Government. Democrats try to pass Tim Walz off as a small-town moderate, America's coach. The reality is entirely different. As Minnesotans know, he is a hardcore left-winger. Walz is in the midst of a radical overhaul of K-12 education in Minnesota. The curriculum of every class, in every grade, in every school is now required to include instruction in ethnic studies. In fact, ethnic studies means anti-American, anti-free enterprise, anti-Semitic, racist propaganda. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear from the man whom Tim Walz appointed to the committee that is writing the official implementation framework that will dictate ethnic studies curriculum for all Minnesota public schools, Brian Lazinski. Lazinski, a Minnesota professor, is a national leader on ethnic studies, and he is the de facto leader of the Minnesota Ethnic Studies Working Group. Walz knew what he was getting when he put Lazinski in charge of overhauling Minnesota's K-12 education. His track record is as far left as you can get. Stanley Kurtz has a superb long article on Lazinski and Minnesota's Ethnic Studies Initiative, which American Experiment has battled against tooth and nail in National Review. You should read the whole thing. It's a great piece of work, but for now I want to focus on the May 27, 2022 video that Lazinski posted on YouTube and which Kurtz unearthed. In this video, Lazinski explains what critical race theory means and calls for the overthrow of the government of the United States.
The first tenet of critical race theory is that the United States as constructed is irreversibly racist. So if the nation state as constructed is irreversibly racist, then it must be done with. It must be overthrown, right? And so we can't be like, oh no, critical race theory is just about telling our stories and divert. It's not about that. It's about overthrow. It's insurgent. And we need to be, I think, more honest with that. And it's funny that they don't understand critical race theory, but they actually tell some truth when they're like, yeah, it is anti-state. You can't be a critical race theorist and be pro-US. Okay, it is an anti-state theory that says the United States needs to be deconstructed, period. Right? Like that's, and so I think it's an interesting argument there, and that's why I'm a critical race theorist. But
now I'm grateful here for Lazinski's honesty about his intentions and his agenda. He's certainly been significantly more honest than Minnesota Democrats in the trifecta and Governor Tim Walz. he admits and he actually advocates for being open and transparent about what it is that they're trying to do. He says our objective is to overthrow the U.S. government. Our objective is to be done with the United States. And we're going to hijack, effectively, the education system in the state of Minnesota to try to indoctrinate children to become activists to that effect. That's the clear implication of his words. And that is the actual effect that is trying to be implemented through the inclusion of quote-unquote ethnic studies in our schools. I addressed this on the House floor when this provision was being discussed. The idea, because again, Democrats not being honest, not being transparent, not willing to discuss with the people of Minnesota what their actual intentions were with this, tried to paper over it with these euphemisms and reductions that portray the project as something more benign than what it actually is. But all you need to do is look at the original language that they were proposing throughout this process to see the radical intention that Lisinski himself supports.
This isn't about history. It's not about being seen. How do we know? Well, because we can read what you're doing. We can read the social studies standards. One person who's read them is Catherine Kirsten, former Star Tribune columnist, writing for The Federalist. She writes, "To see what's coming, look at Minnesota, where this spring," this is in October of 2023 that she's writing this, "lawmakers enacted what are likely the most radical education measures in the nation. This is ethnic studies in its liberated form, which not only teaches race-based identities and white privilege, but incites students to take action to disrupt and dismantle America's fundamental social and political institutions." That sounds awfully political, don't you think? Our educational goal in the state of Minnesota is to disrupt and dismantle our institutions?
Now, one of the things that we should point out here is how inherently anti-democratic this entire project is. And that's revealed in the effort to water down and reduce and minimize the actual intention of what they're trying to accomplish. If, in fact, Minnesota Democrats cared about democracy, which is to say, if, in fact, they wanted representative government that actually reflects the values and principles and ideas of the residents who live in this state, then they would be more than happy to be as transparent as Lisinski is. They would be more than happy to tell you, yes, we're going to take your children, put them in a classroom, and try to convince them that the United States should be abolished because it's irredeemably racist. But they're not willing to tell you that because they know that's an incredibly unpopular position, that the agenda that they are going to affect through the implementation of these standards is an agenda that the vast majority of Minnesotans do not agree with. And they don't care. They don't care what you think. They don't care what your values are. They don't care whether your community is going to be enormously disrupted by injecting into our youth this idea that they should be judging one another according to the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. In point of fact, they want to affect that against your will. They want to defy the will of the people. And they successfully have. They successfully have. Through their lying, through the lack of media coverage, through the lack of attention that the reality of these ethnic standards are going to affect, they have slipped one past the goalie. And you can blame not just them, but you should also blame the media for not covering it. This story that I'm talking about here with you today is several days old. To my knowledge, there's been no extensive mainstream media coverage over the revelations regarding Lisinski and his comments and their obvious implications for ethnic studies and how they're going to be implemented in the state of Minnesota, because they don't want you to know. Your media does not want you to know what's actually going to impact your life. Your media does not actually want you to know what it is that your government is doing, because your media is 100% in the bag for the Democrat Party and for this agenda that is only being transparently revealed by these unearthed comments from Lisinski, who again is effectively at the head of this movement to provide an implementation framework for our ethnic study standards in public education. And so what can we do about it? Well, we've got an election coming up, and the results of that election should most definitely reflect your response to this encroachment upon your right to be politically represented. The people who are currently empowered in the state of Minnesota, the Democrat trifecta, do not care about you. They do not care about what you want. They abhor your values. They think you're racist. And we know that because they are selecting and appointing people who believe those things to direct the education of your children. That is as clear a piece of evidence as anyone should require to know that these people hate you. They despise you. They call us despicable. They call us deplorable for fighting against this, for objecting to it. You should believe them. You should believe the things that they say about how horrible they think you are as a result of the color of your skin. And you should fight back accordingly. This election is one way to do that, but there are many, many other ways. The implementation of this is going to trickle down to our school districts. It's going to trickle down to individual administrations and ultimately into the classroom. And I'm calling upon educators throughout the state of Minnesota to actively resist this abhorrent ideological perversion that is being tried to be implemented and pushed down from the top down through our school system to poison the minds of our children to get them to hate one another. You know, my youngest son is 11 years old. He just started middle school. He's a great kid he should have been born when I was back in the 80s, because back then we didn't think twice about leaving the house and getting on our bikes and going 2 miles away from home and killing time and exploring and getting in a little bit of trouble, but making sure we were home when the lights came on. That's the spirit and the heart of my youngest son. The two closest friends he has is a East African gal who lives across the street who's the same age, and a stereotypically blonde-haired, blue-eyed white kid who's a few doors down. And between the three of them, they represent the entire spectrum of racial diversity within our community, within our society. And yet they get along, with few exceptions, that they work out and then they get together the next day and they're playing like nothing happened. But generally speaking, they enjoy each other's company. What the implementation of these policies is going to do is to teach them to hate one another, to teach them that they live in an irredeemably racist society, and that their top objective should be dismantling and overthrowing the United States of America. I do not consent to that. I know many teachers and administrators throughout our public education system do not consent to that. So don't comply with it. Resist it. Reject it. Fight back. And elect school board members this November who are going to do the same. We do not have to do what we're told by these racist, tyrannical, anti-democrat tyrants who are currently running state government in Minnesota. We do not have to obey them, and we will not when the effect of obedience is the toxic poisoning of our children's minds.
Liberty's Ledger with Walter Hudson. Like, share, and subscribe to show your support. Follow Walter on X at Walter Hudson. Visit hudsonformn.com.